right, so good afternoon, everyone who is in so far, and welcome to anyone who is watching after the fact. And today's virtual visit, we are virtually heading to the Leventhal Map and Education Center at the Boston Public Library. For everyone's awareness, we are recording today's visit, which we don't normally do. But if you are more comfortable leaving your cameras and microphones off, that's totally fine. And we will have the chat open throughout the entire presentation. So feel free to communicate and ask questions that way. Few updates from the Old Colony History Museum before I turn things over to our friends at the Leventhal Map Center. Our photo scanning day is tomorrow. We do those on the first Saturday of every month. So if you have any photos from the Taunton area, we would love to scan those and add them to our digital archive. Next week, we have Crafternoons every day, and we will be making pop-up place cards to adorn our Thanksgiving tables. So I'd love for you to join us anytime between 1 and 3. You can drop in on those. We'll also have a very busy Saturday next week. So not only is it the last day of our Crafternoons, here at the museum, we have hands-on history all day. We'll be separating fact from fiction and learning all about the story of Elizabeth Pole. Also on Saturday at 11 o'clock in the morning, we have our last cemetery tour of the season. We're heading to Mount Pleasant again, but this time we'll be focusing on all the veterans that are buried there. So if you would like to join us for that, meet us at the Barnum Street entrance at 11 a.m. And you can get more information on Eventbrite about parking. On the 18th, Thursday, we have the final session for our Facts and Family Introduction to Genealogy course, but you can jump in on those at any time. You don't have to have been to the other sessions to join this one. So if you're curious and interested in genealogy, that's another one. We just ask that you register on Eventbrite. There is a cost to that one. If you're an OCHM member, it's $5. We will also have a lecture that night. We're welcoming food historian Paula Marcoux here to the museum, so you can join our live audience or you can watch from home on Zoom. Again, you'll just have to register on Eventbrite. You can find more information about everything we're doing there and on our website. We will be closed on Wednesday the 24th and Thursday the 25th for our Thanksgiving break, but we'll reopen and kick off the holiday shopping season for Small Business Saturday on the 27th. And now for today's virtual visit. For anyone who came in the meantime, just so you know, we are recording. So if you missed anything at the beginning, you can always watch. With us from the Leventhal Map and Education Center is Garrett Nelson. He's the president and head curator there, and he's going to show us all about what they have on offer, what we could see, and their digital things that you can do on the website. So I'm going to turn it over to Garrett, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So please feel free to use that chat and submit any questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. It's great to quote unquote be here. I confess that I've actually never visited the Old Colony History Museum. And so it's a great excuse for me to come virtually and then pen in time to come physically sometime over the next couple months. But really a pleasure to be here. Before I start, a couple things. We always like to start our programs by taking note of the complicated and contested threads that are woven into historical geography. And that includes lots of difficult stories that we can't ignore and we shouldn't ignore. The place we call Boston is the ancestral and current home to indigenous people, including the Mashpee and Aquino Wampanoag tribes, the Nipmuc nations, and descendants of the Massachusetts people. Copley Square, where I'm sitting right now, is on top of a filled tidal estuary that once featured some of the most advanced marine agricultural techniques in all of North America. So the maps that are in our collection, they bear witness not only to histories of colonial expropriation, but also to conflicts that range from labor struggles to racial segregation. And in a lot of cases, the maps don't just document those stories, they were actually played a role in making them happen in the first place. So whenever we do programs or interpretation with our collections, we like to foreground that and to encourage people to consider and engage with how these histories are still with us in the present day. The other thing I want to say is just an orientation a little bit to the center and what we have. I'm going to be talking today generally about how to use our collections for historic research, for local history, for exploring the area around Taunton and the Old Colony and Massachusetts and New England, but also to encourage you to come visit us in the Central Library. The Leventhal Map and Education Center is an independent nonprofit. We exist inside of the Central Library, but we're not, in fact, a department of the library. We're reliant on generous donors. So if you like today's program, of course, I hope you support the Old Colony History Museum, but I also encourage you to visit our website as well and support our work. I'll be telling more later about how to come visit us and what you might see if you do. I'll also note I'm joined on the call today with two of our brand new staff members. Emily Bowe is the assistant director at the Map Center, and Ian Spangler is our brand spanking new assistant curator for digital geography. They're just here to listen in. This is one of their first online public programs that they'll be a part of. But Emily and Ian and all of the Map Center staff, for that matter, are just amazing, smart, interesting people. And we always love to hear from visitors, patrons of all walks of life. So Emily and Ian are here, and you're more than welcome to reach out to them, both during and after the talk. So I'm gonna bring up a quick slideshow, just 1 second. What I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about what's in the Map Center's collections. Oh, Sarah, I think you need to give me permission to share my screen. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what's in our collections and how to use maps for geographic research. I've pulled maps and examples that relate to the area that the Old Colony History Museum is in. But I always like to remind people, we are not local historians of every single place. We do a lot of talks from many different places. And, oftentimes we get questions like, did this building change in 1850? And chances are I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not an expert on Taunton or Plymouth or any of these towns specifically. But what I do know is how to help you find maps, how to think about maps as historic objects, and what I hope we'll also do today is to get you to think in more complicated ways about maps, not just as these dusty old documents, but as really sort of forms of visual evidence that make us think about the past in different ways. All right, now I can share my screen. So while we'll be using some Plymouth Colony examples as in the talk, hopefully some of the lessons here are more generally applicable to historic research and maps, broadly speaking. A little bit more about what we have in the collections. So the Boston Public Library is the oldest large municipal public library in the United States. It's been collecting antiquarian material since it was founded in the 1850s. Here's some maps on display in the late 19th century, right after the Central Library opened in Copley Square. The Leventhal Map Center also cares for the private collection of Norman Leventhal, who was a map collector during his whole life and amassed one of the most important Boston and New England collections. So both the BPL collections and the Leventhal collections together form the most significant archive of cartographic material about Boston and Massachusetts. And they're all here at a public library for you to use. We also have a gallery in the Central Library where we host free exhibitions. Our current exhibition that you see in this photo is called Bending Lines, Maps and Data from Distortion to Deception. And in that exhibition, we take you into all of the ways that maps can lie and deceive and persuade, not only for kind of sinister reasons, but also for powerful reasons. How basically we tell stories with maps, how they reshape our sense of reality, and how we come to believe the things that we see in maps. We're open 6 days a week. Admission to the gallery is free. You can spend 20 minutes or 4 hours in our gallery. We'd love to come see you, or we'd love for you to come see us. We also do education programs and research visits in our classroom center. We have a very strong K-12 program. If you're a school teacher, if you have kids in the school system, we encourage you to reach out to our education team to book a program. We also have lots of online resources for teachers, like curricular material. We've also done a ton of digital projects, and a lot of that is going to be the basis for today's talk, since I'm not physically with you all. What I'm going to be talking about is sort of how you can use the Leventhal Center collections and stuff we have from the comfort of your own home, or from, you know, the thumbs on your phone screen. Our digital projects range from historic materials all the way through data visualizations and engagements with contemporary maps, and all of them are available on our website, leventhalmap.org. So in today's talks, I've got sort of 5 maxims for thinking about maps as historical objects. And in these sort of 5 points, which I'm going to illustrate with maps from your region, one of the things that I want to sort of get you away from is thinking about the map just as this thing that has answers about the past. We can sometimes get tricked into thinking that way because maps are so part of our lives, giving us answers to questions like, how long will my commute be today? Or how many Dunkin' Donuts are within 600 feet of me at any given time? We use maps all the time in this kind of practical way to just answer a simple question. And maps are useful for that. They're obviously like embedded in our lives in that way. But when we think about historical maps, they sometimes answer questions, but they sometimes invite us into much more complicated ways of thinking about the past and present. The first of these is that oftentimes it's tempting to think of maps as just a backdrop to history, like almost like setting the stage, and then you populate it with characters and people, and then, you know, the maps are just sort of the scene of history. Instead of thinking about maps that way, as like, you know, I put a map of Taunton on my book about Taunton because that just sort of like illustrated the scene, we can instead think about how maps invite us to think geographically about history. And when I talk about thinking geographically, what I mean is, how are people, the natural environment, communities, social groups related to each other in space, right? How are near things and far things related to one another? How does the world we occupy have very much to do with where things are and who's near, who are our neighbors, how are things connected, and how are things disconnected? You all may know this map. I don't know if maybe the museum has a copy of it yourself. This is a O.H. Bailey 1875 bird's eye view of Taunton. Bird's eye views are some of the most kind of fun visual maps to look at from the late 19th century. They're primarily produced by kind of urban boosters. So a map like this one would have been commissioned by the leading citizens of Taunton to kind of brag about, you know, here's our thriving city, here are its civic buildings. And note that in 1875, nobody had ever seen Taunton from the sky before. There were no airplanes, there were no aerial photography. You didn't go on Google Maps to get a satellite view. So these aerial bird's eye view maps, the O.H. Bailey Company is a prolific creator of bird's eye view maps at this time. They become the only ways that people can see the geography that they occupy. So maps like these would have been people's sole sort of visual evidence for the geography around them. I pulled out, sorry, I was probably familiar with this, and I hope you confirm it. I think 7 is the Bristol Academy, which is your building today. Is that right?
Yes, that's us.
Yeah. So
it's one of my favorite maps.
So we've already answered a kind of question here, right? Like what was the building that the museum is in today? What was it in 1875? But as you go back to the map, you might ask some other questions like, why is Taunton located where it is? Like, what is its relationship to the river and the surrounding natural environment? Why did it develop the way it did? If we zoom into the little neighborhood right around the museum, who was living in these buildings? Was it occupied by laborers? Was it occupied by a particular ethnic immigrant group to Taunton at the time? How about the sort of surrounding rural landscape? In 1875, Taunton was still immediately faced up to agricultural land and an agricultural economy. You can see the rail lines that fed the city and connected it to other places. All of those are sort of geographical questions about what was going on at this time, not just like practically where was it, but how does the story of a place like Taunton have everything to do with mills and rail connections and industrial geography and immigrant geography? I could talk for an hour about just this map alone, even though I know very little about Taunton itself. The way that a map invites us to think geographically about the past, to think about the relationships of where things were and how they were connected to each other. The second thing that I want to encourage you all to think about is think about the map not just as telling you something about the place that it shows, but also telling you a lot, sometimes even more, about the people and institutions who made the map. So the O.H. Bailey map that we just saw, I told you this would have been commissioned by the sort of leading citizens of Taunton. It tells you a lot about like what did they think was important, right? So this list of civic buildings, pictures of industry here, right? You know, in the 21st century, you probably wouldn't put like dirty smokestacks on the front of your advertisement of your city. But in 1875, these factories belching smoke were, you know, Tauntonites, is that the right term? Do you say Tauntonites, Tauntonians? You know, would have been proud of this, right? At least the sort of white business elite that commissioned this O.H. Bailey map. They wanted you to know that there were factories here, that there was industrial development. And so we've already learned something about the people who commissioned that map. Here's another example, right? You know, commercial maps are some of the obvious ones that tell us a lot about the priorities of the people who printed them. There's a lot of maps similar to this in our current exhibition in the gallery right now. So we look at advertising and commercial speculation. Here's a map of the Old Colony railroad system, advertising Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. And you know the timetables for those routes, and obviously boldface. You can see the lines, the roots of the Old Colony system are bolded here. So you know, is this an accurate map of all of New England's resort economy in 1893? Well, you probably want to think a little bit about the fact that it's a commercial publication. Obviously, Old Colony Line wanted you to focus on the Old Colony Line system and take their trains and not anybody else's trains. So this map tells us a lot about the commercial point of view of railroad speculators in the late 19th century and what kinds of tourist economies they were promoting, what kinds of language they used to show Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket as desirable destinations for Bostonians. So the map is created by somebody, right? That's true of modern maps too. You know, we think of Google Maps and Apple Maps as being like made by computers, but in fact, those maps are also tell us a lot about, you know, who collected the data that goes into them. You know, what do Apple and Google want us to see? You know, you'll notice, for instance, on a Google map that certain businesses are highlighted, and that's not random. That's telling us a little bit about the commercial ecosystem of Google's mapping practices. Another principle to keep in mind is, especially when thinking about historical maps, it's easy to think that they're just a snapshot of the past, right? This map of 1855 shows how things were exactly in 1855. There's some obvious clues. So, you know, again, to look at this 1875 map of Taunton, you can see there's sort of people walking around downtown and little illustrations of horse carts and stuff like that. And you can probably guess that it's not like somebody took a photograph and captured exactly what this, you know, what Taunton looked like at 4 p.m. on a certain afternoon. So there's already a kind of time trickery here. It's showing this like generalized imaginary view of what an ordinary sort of a day in 1875 might look like in Taunton. But another kind of trick of time that maps do is that maps oftentimes are published to predict the future. We tend to call those kinds of maps plans, but not always. And so there are a lot of maps in our historic collections that if you looked at them and said, wow, I never knew that was built there, or that, you know, this was designed in this way. It could be that it really never was, and that what you're looking at is a map of a future plan which was never executed. Here's a plan of the State Farm at Bridgewater. I think this is part of close to Bridgewater State College now. So again, I would have to dig a little deeper into this the history of this place to say. You can tell here that this was used to kind of design and plan for the future, especially given that the legend shows that it's done by the superintendent. Another thing to keep in mind with maps is that they always simplify reality. Even the very, very best maps have to kind of simplify things down and leave stuff out. They omit, they make assumptions about what's important and what's not important. That's an inherent part of visual representation. So the only fully accurate map of the world is the whole world itself, which is really inconvenient to carry in your pocket. So anytime you're scaling down the world and putting it on a map, you're going to leave some things out and include others. And that makes some things easier to see, and it makes other features much more difficult to see. A really important example of this principle, especially in maps of New England in the 17th and 18th century, is the removal of native people from maps. This is one of the earliest English maps of New England. It's John Sellers' 1675 map of New England. Do you see my cursor on the screen? Does it show up here? So you probably recognize the shape of Cape Cod. This yellow outline is the Plymouth Colony. There's some native people in what we call the cartouche. So this is the legend, or the title of the map is in a figure called a cartouche. And there's some sort of illustrations of native people and a kind of imaginary illustration of a native settlement. But a lot of what would have actually been the native geography of New England is left off of this map for a couple of reasons. One is that English mapmakers just didn't know that much about the interior of New England. But another was they had obviously a prevailing interest in making New England look empty. Historians talk a lot about the wilderness myth of the Americas, right? This idea that Europeans kind of confected the idea that North America was empty, that it was an untamed wilderness, that it was not settled, so that they could justify their own colonial practices, that they could justify their own settlement and their removal of people who had lived here for thousands of years. And maps did a lot of that work for them, right? Maps are made that show the interior of North America, the interior of New England as empty, even though it was, in fact, a pretty densely settled pattern of native presence. So sometimes those omissions are deliberate, sometimes those omissions are accidental, but it's really important to kind of read the absences in a map, read what's missing in a map. If we went back to that O.H. Bailey map one more time, right? We're not seeing, like, the shacks of casual laborers. We're not seeing we're not seeing real details about agricultural landscape on the outside of town. There's a lot that's left out as well. And thinking and wondering about why those things got left out is an important part of looking at a historic map. And the last principle to keep in mind here is that when we think about the geography of the past, it's really great to engage with maps yourself as a map maker. And that means mapping in all sorts of different ways. It doesn't mean that you have to be trained as a cartographer or a computer mapper or a GIS analyst. Jotting down everything from, like, your understanding of how your own neighborhood is connected to the center of town, or doing more modern kind of visual techniques can help us see things that are difficult to see if we don't make a map of them. This is a modern map of the Plymouth County, area around Plymouth County, looking at demographic data from the census. This is called the racial dot map of the United States. It's really interesting looking at major metro areas. If you look at Boston or New York or Chicago. But what's been done here is that every dot on this map is one person from the census, and the colors correspond to people's racial identity. And you can see pretty clearly here the suburban whiteness of Massachusetts, and then the diversity of Brockton, right? One of Massachusetts' most diverse cities, most non-white cities. In this particular map, I left the legend off of it. So blue is white people, green are African Americans, and orange, there's not too many. You see a few on the edge here of Providence, are Latinx people or people of Hispanic heritage. And red is Asian, though there's very, very few on this particular view. But so that raises some questions. How did Brockton get to be the way it is in 2021? And why does it look different from Taunton? That's a geographic question that you might not even think to ask if you weren't looking at a visualization like this one. So before, I'm going to switch over to my my computer's browser to take you kind of through a tour of doing online research in the Map Center's collections. And then I want to save some time for questions at the end. But this is just my closing slide to remind you, leventhalmap.org, or we have a pretty active social media presence on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at BPL Maps. We post almost every day something interesting from the collections. So if you're interested in more of this, you can find us there. I'm going to jump over into my computer browser just so I can kind of take you on a tour of how would you do historic research in our collections from home and use some of our digital resources. So let's switch over to this browser. You'll see that okay? Great. So from our main website, leventhalmap.org, tons of resources here. Again, I mentioned education programs, but I'll draw your attention for the purposes of today's talk to the collections and research sections of our website. Under the research tab of our website, you can submit reference requests to our librarians. You can book a time to come in and see a rare map in our Rare Maps reading room. And you don't need to have a well-defined question. We really encourage general questions like I'm interested in, I don't know, I'm interested in Taunton and I want to know what you have for Taunton. Our reference librarians are really amazing about being able to bring up a kind of extensive list of what we might have on a topic that's of interest to you. But if you want to do kind of work on your own, from the collections section of our website, that's where you can really dive into what we have available digitally. We have two major repositories of digitized maps. The biggest is our digital collections repository, which has about 10,000 scanned maps. And then we have several hundred bound atlases that are available in the Internet Archive. From our collections site here, you can search for anything and it will search both of those repositories. If I search Taunton, you can see there's nothing for Taunton in the Internet Archive. That's because the Internet Archive is mostly, like I said, world atlases. But you see we have 10 results from the digital collections repository that match the keyword Taunton. That'll bring you over into our digital collections portal where you can pull up full resolution images and zoom really closely into the historic maps. There's that 1875 Bailey view that I showed you in the slideshow. But there's a bunch of other interesting things here as well. I thought that this map of Bristol County was pretty interesting. This is made by a guy named H.F. Walling, who does a lot of the sort of like county scale maps of Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. He's one of the more important Massachusetts cartographers of the time. And again, the sort of density of information on these maps is really astounding. And it's something that invites you to zoom all the way in, which is one of the features of our digital collections. You can we're looking at Norton here, and you can come all the way and you can see, you can read annotations about the townhouse, who lived in these various buildings. There's the Taunton Branch Railroad. You can see things like the Great Cedar Swamp over here. There's you know, you could zoom in and browse around just this one map for a long time, picking out interesting pieces from it. The other thing that I want to note that you can do specifically in our digital collections portal is you can see maps that have been what's called geo-referenced. None of these Taunton maps actually have been geo-referenced. Geo-referencing is a process that involves matching a map to like a modern map, figuring out where it would lay on top of what you would think of as a Google map today. So none of the Taunton ones have been geo-referenced yet, but I'll show you some Plymouth maps that have been geo-referenced. Here's a map of the town of Plymouth from, one second for it to load. That's my internet connection. Might be a little slow here. Oh, come on. There we go. This is an 1874 Beers map of Plymouth. Beers is another cartographer firm that you see come up very often, especially in detailed mid-19th century maps of cities. And if you click on the map overlay tab, you can see this is actually done by patrons. They've chosen points on the map that allow us to match it back into reality. And now we're zooming into downtown Plymouth, and you can, if you were to take this opacity slider, you can see there's the modern map of Plymouth that you recognize today. And here it is laid, the historic map laid on top of it. So you can zoom all the way in here and pick, Davis Hall here. And what's where Davis Hall is? The Uva Wine Bar is there. I don't know downtown Plymouth super well, but maybe any of you have been in Plymouth recently could tell us whether the Uva Wine Bar is occupying a historic building that was once called Davis Hall and a post office. So that ability to georeference and compare maps that way is a really powerful way to explore the collections. Now, what I'm going to show you next is really only applies to Boston, but it's something that we're hoping to expand in the future to other cities and towns in Massachusetts. We built a tool called Atlascope, which takes georeferencing kind of to the next level of being able to compare different maps to one another. This Atlascope tool just covers Metro Boston, so Boston proper, Cambridge, Somerville, and a few other cities and towns that are near to Boston. But what it lets you do is you can search a specific address. I'm going to search 700 Boylston Street, which is the library, and it will take you right through. So there's a modern map. I'm looking at the library. I could actually change that to an aerial view if I wanted, like this. You can see here's the central library. And then I'm kind of peeking through the modern map, in this case to an 1874 map, which is not very interesting because in 1874, the Back Bay had just been filled, so there's no buildings here. But as we walk through time, one of the cool things about Atlascope is it pulls up all the maps that are specifically in view for wherever you're looking at. So I could go to 1895, just after the BPL is built. You see, you can zoom right in here. The original McKim building of the BPL has been built. Harvard Medical School used to be our neighbor in 1895. And then we can kind of walk through time and see things change. I'll just choose a couple. 1912, that became BU. 1938, you can see more streetcar lines have come in. This is really an amazing resource for exploring Boston proper. And we're hoping that we might, in the next few years, secure some grant funding to extend this. There are maps like this of almost every city and town of Massachusetts. So we're hoping to develop that out. So coming soon, maybe Taunton and Plymouth and other places in Atlascope as well. The last thing that I just wanted to share is we also have on the digital collection portals some kind of like selected, curated sets of maps, primarily for teaching purposes. So if you go over to this Tools for Teachers page of the website, you can browse what we call map sets on different themes. So you could look, for instance, for the American Revolution, and we have sets for teaching the American Revolution and Boston's geography of the American Revolution. That's another way to kind of access maps that are key to different areas. I want to save time to kind of explore and field questions. Like if anybody on the Zoom has specific towns or places that you want us to kind of peek into, we can do that in real time. We can talk more about maps and historical geography generally. Happy to go in whichever direction this group is curious to explore more in. So, or Soraya, if you have questions as well, let me know.
So yeah, if anybody wants to see anything in particular, feel free to either unmute or type in the chat. I was curious, if someone wanted to come and see a specific map in person, how would they go about doing that?
Yes, and I'm sorry, I just pronounced your name wrong. I realized.
That's right. I'm used to it.
So any of our maps can be seen by anybody from the public. We don't charge a fee for it. You do need to get a BPL research card, which is free. You just have to register for it's a specific research card. It's not, if you happen to have a borrowing card, if you're anybody who lives in Massachusetts can get a DPL borrowing card, but anybody from anywhere, even if you're not from Massachusetts, can get a DPL research card. And all you have to do is to make a request on our website under the research tab, and we ask for 24 hours in advance so that we can pull the map for you. But we have a reading room here. It's open 5 days a week on weekdays. And if those times don't work out for you, we can always try to schedule with one of the reference librarians. Yes, I see Ian has just dropped the link right in for you. So we love having people at the center. During COVID, we have a little bit of space capacity in the reading room itself. So, we just need to schedule things in advance, but please do come by if there's anything that you'd like to see. I guess I should have, let me take you back actually briefly to my screen share here. So I said 10,000 of our maps, roughly 10,000 of our maps have been digitized, but we have about 250,000 maps in the collection. So there are a lot of maps that have not, in fact, been digitized. This search that I already showed you will search the digital collections, but you can also search the entire catalog. So this will search the entire catalog. I'm just randomly keyword searching Taunton. Looks like we have 15 results that come up for the term Taunton. Here's another case where the librarians can be really helpful for you. So I just put in Taunton, but you might want to search for Bristol County. You might want to search for Massachusetts, right? Obviously, there are maps of Massachusetts that show Taunton, but might not have the word Taunton in their keyword title. So we can help you with some tricks about finding things if your initial searches don't turn up what you're expecting.
Thank you. Good to know. Emily answered this, but maybe we could peek at one of them. Maps of Fairhaven from 1800 to 1870.
Yeah.
I was curious about those.
Yes, let me share my screen. It looks like we've got 2 maps that come up for a search of Fairhaven. Where did I just screen share go here? This one looks like the slightly more interesting one. The other one seems like it centers on New Bedford. So here's Fairhaven. This is a 1855 map. It's Walling. Remember, so the Bristol County map that I showed you was H.F. Walling. His name pops up very frequently, especially for middle 19th century maps. Oftentimes it's useful to start with the cartouche or the legend. This one's really got some beautiful typography on it. Surveyed by order of the town by H.F. Walling. So the town government of Fairhaven was able to get Walling. So they chose the best. And 1855, this was surveyed. Let's take a look. Judy, do you have any particular parts of Fairhaven that you want to zoom in on? You can put in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute if I can figure out how to get back to the chat. If there's anything in particular you want to see here, I confess I don't know Fairhaven well. So here's a branch railroad. I suspect was that part of the old colony system coming into Fairhaven Village. We've got the bridge going over into New Bedford, Pope's Island, little building on Pope's Island. I guess that looks like it's on the New Bedford side. Oxford area. Okay, so here's the Oxford neighborhood. You can see a handful of names. Delano, Mrs. Nye, Charles Tabor, the Riverside Cemetery, a salt works. That's kind of interesting. So this little point across from the asylum and the Woodside Cemetery had a salt works. That's intriguing. Curious what's there today. Let's actually, is this map georeferenced? No, it's not georeferenced. So it's a future project to georeference this particular map, but I'm sure we could look at a modern map and try to figure out where this salt works was. One of my favorite things, actually, coming back to this sort of like geographic approaches to history, is oftentimes looking at these older maps, you can kind of understand some of the logic of how cities are laid out better than you do just walking around or looking at a modern map. So you see things like, oh, this road ran between two low areas. It went from one spot where there was a cove over the, the low part of the hills to the place where the railroad crossing was. And that road probably still exists. You don't think of it as having that kind of connection anymore. But it draws your attention to the way that our present day geographies are still very much dependent on choices in the past about where to locate things. Any other questions about specific places? If people have other towns they want to pull up, or keywords for us to search, or how do you look at a map? What are some key things to pay attention to? Any of those topics are fair game.
What's I didn't check. What was the oldest Taunton map that you guys have?
The oldest one that we have in the digital collections, let's see, at least the oldest that is specifically of Taunton. So again, like that John Sellers 1675 map, that shows Taunton, right? Taunton is on there, but it might not be the most useful thing if we are interested in the small scale geography. That's an important, thinking about maps and their relationship to scale, right? A map of North America in 1500 includes Taunton, right? But it may not be what we're looking for if we're looking for like the earliest map of the local geography of Taunton. Looks like we have a Cape Breton map that has the word Taunton in it somewhere, so that's not our Taunton. Maybe there's a Taunton on Cape Breton Island. Looks like the oldest map that's digitized is an 1836 Dunbar map. Do you know this one? I'll bring it up.
Yeah, I know that one.
So this one's interesting too. Oftentimes maps, especially 19th century maps, are cool because of the marginal materials. So this one has some really beautiful illustrated elevations of buildings. It's the Universalist Church, Methodist Church. This is also a kind of example of how high resolution our scanned maps are. You can see all these folds and brittle creases in the map. Which is a reminder that this is a material object that's in our collection somewhere. So yeah, I've got these interesting hand-drawn elevations of some of the important civic buildings. What else do we see here? Here's the center of Taunton. 1836 is probably before the Bristol Academy. I don't know, what's your building from, Saria?
Yeah, so there was a school here, but it looked different. They built this building in 1852.
Okay.
But there was a Bristol Academy. It was just a different structure. It was a wood building.
So you're right here-ish, right?
Yeah.
So the current building is not yet on this map.
No, not yet.
Interesting, you see like bridges, neck of land, those, again, paying attention to what people care about, right? Being able to cross a river was a really important thing in 1830s. Maybe don't think of it as central to our lives today, but where were the river crossings, train depot, 1830, this has got to be one of our earliest maps that shows trains at all. 1836 is very, very, very early for railroads. Obviously, Taunton grew partly because it was one of the first places in Massachusetts that had a railroad running to it. Yeah, so an super interesting map here.
Lots of things I recognize.
Yeah.
Interesting annotations of where the mills were, like cotton mills and the Britannia Works. That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super interesting. What is that?
Yep.
Brits Works?
Yeah, that would be Yep, the Britannia works. Would be
Yeah.
the Brit works.
Yeah, cool.
Super cool.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. That here's interesting. Do you know anything about this canal from Prospect Hill Pond? You can see that the map maker here has just left off the border. You know, it just cuts off at the edge of Taunton, but that's intriguing.
Yeah, that is.
This is sort of back to that point of like the map tends to open up more questions than it answers, right? So I like to think of maps as something that then whets your appetite to hit other forms of historical research. Maybe we can find, you know, manuscript records of, you know, who owned land around Prospect Hill Pond and who was building a canal. Did they get a grant from the state, land grant from the state to build that canal? You know, what was going on here? Are there other town records that might refer to it? 1830 is too early for photographs, but as we get into later maps, then you can start thinking of like, can I search photographic collections to see what this building or what this neighborhood might have looked like? The map is a kind of spatial index for all sorts of other questions about the past.
A question had come in about Sanborn maps. I don't know if you could show us any of those. That would be cool to see. We do have a few more minutes.
Yes, so the Atlascope tool that I showed you, I'll bring that up one more time. The maps that are in Atlascope are a collection that we call the Fire Insurance and Real Estate Collection. So these maps were produced originally for primarily fire insurance underwriters. That was their main reason for being made at such level of detail. These, for instance, the color of these buildings has to do with their building material. Pink is a brick building, and there's tons of detail about ownership, how many stories they were, and that information was used by fire insurance companies to underwrite fire insurance. The most famous of these companies was the Sanborn Company. So sometimes people call these maps Sanborn maps generically, all of them Sanborn maps. The one we're looking at right now is actually a Bromley map, and a lot of our maps of Boston are produced by the Bromley firm, but there are some Sanborn maps in here. Trying to remember where exactly. I know that there's some Sanborns over here in what's now South Boston. You can see here, so as you move around Atlascope, it pulls up the different years. So where we're looking right now, we have an 1868 Sanborn, an 1870 Sanborn, some Hopkins, some Bromley atlases. I'll go to the 1885 one. Sanborns are particularly kind of detailed. Here's a great example of grain, all the notes about a grain elevator. I'll rotate it so you can read it a bit better. So all of this detail on this Sanborn map, the map itself marks where the grain elevators were. Here's a single grain gallery. And then it talks about you know, the capacity of the building materials. And then what did fire insurers care about? Windows, fire ladder, passenger elevator, pipes connected to the city's water main, fire pump in the engine room, all of these incredible details about the building itself. Just to give you a sense of like Atlascope as a project. So this is that Sanborn Atlas zoomed all the way out. What we had to do to make this tool was, this Sanborn Atlas probably had a dozen or 24 plates, individual plates, and we had to digitally extract out every plate, warp it into its correct position on a modern map, and then stitch all of those plates back together. So what you're seeing here is, you know, maybe 20 or 30 large pages of a bound map that have been digitally merged back together into their real geography. Sometimes you can see a sort of reminder of that when you're looking at the edge, right? You can actually see here, that's the edge of two pages. Sometimes you can sort of see the folds at the edges that are kind of visual reminders of the fact that this did come from an actual book at one point. While we're here, I'll point out one other interesting thing about the Sanborn maps. This was done to Bromley maps as well, but Sanborns are kind of more interesting. You can see here how there's actually been 2 layers pasted on. You can see a little bit of the shadow where the upper bit of paper is curled up, and then there's another piece pasted over here. Especially as you hit the 20th century, the publishers realize that things are changing so fast that instead of putting out new volumes each year, it makes more sense to just send out little scraps of paper to tape on to show the updates. Again, it was really important to have up-to-date information. The insurers didn't want to be writing policies that were based on information that was 5 years out of date. So they'd send around these paste ups and then, with instructions, paste this over 6 and 4 Tuckerman Street in the right position, paste this piece over 15, whatever street that is, 15 Middle Street. That actually makes it a little challenging for us today to say what year are we actually looking at, right? Because sometimes the paste ups cover multiple years, and if we wanted to get under them, we actually can't do that unless we take it to the conservation lab and pull those paste ups off, which we try not to do. It's kind of an interesting material artifact of that era of map making.
We have just a few minutes left, so if anybody has any burning questions they want to get out, like I said, use the chat, unmute, since we have a nice intimate group. Hopefully it won't be a million people talking over each other.
And of course, if you think of questions later, like I said, we're always happy to have you be in touch with either the three of us, or to send a request through our website, or to just stop by sometime and chat with the folks in the gallery.
I think it would be a really fun day of researching and checking out all these maps if you wanted to sort of travel through time down there. Not quite as convenient, might be a little more traffic than we had today getting to check it all out, but it's worth it.
We're very conveniently located near 2 MBTA stops, so
Nice.
It's easy to get in here on the train.
Perfect, good to know. Didn't see any more questions come in. So I guess we could say thank you. And I really enjoyed this. I do a mapping program here with 4th graders, so I love the maps. Cool. Super cool to see the different versions that you guys have. So I loved this a lot, learned a lot too. So I really appreciate you being here with us and showing us around and all these resources that you guys have. It's pretty incredible. I was thinking, as you were saying, you had to stitch together all the maps. I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds very quick and easy. Not at all time consuming.
It took many, many hours of intern labor to produce all of this stuff that's in Atlas Scope. But yeah, and we're continually adding things to our digital collections. We do a lot of online programs, not just about the collections themselves, but topics related to geography. So we just had the historian Kathleen Duval 2 weeks ago talking about Indian borderlands. So all of our programs are always free. You can subscribe to our newsletter if you want to get updates, or follow our website, or visit us on social media.
Cool, thank you. We did have one last question sneak in. Robert, Emily handled it, but asked about the old postcards that have maps on them and if they have been scanned.
Yeah, a lot of the BPL's postcard collection, the most significant is called the Tickner Brothers collection, and many of those have been scanned. So our digital collections is, I see actually Emily has beat me to the link, but our digital collections are part of a larger Massachusetts portal that's run at the BPL called Digital Commonwealth. You may even, I'm sure there are institutions down your neck of the woods that are also Digital Commonwealth partners. But Digital Commonwealth is a great kind of one-stop search for our collections, for the BPL's non-map collections, and like tons of other stuff from institutions as varied as Northeastern University to, small house museums.
Cool, so much information. It's fantastic. We got a lot of research and resources, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you, Garrett and Emily and Ian in the background there, answering all those questions and sharing all the links. Appreciate that. And like I said, everyone, this is being recorded, so if you ever wanted to go back and check something, you'll be able to. We'll have it public in probably a couple weeks, and I'll be sure to share it with you guys too.
Great. I'm really glad that we could join you, and yeah, open invitation to visit us here in Copley Square whenever.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. And thanks everyone who joined us today. And hopefully you'll have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, Aria. Thanks
Thank
everyone
you.
for joining.
Bye, everyone.